Everyone thinks their biggest threat to their wealth is a big lawsuit, a market crash, or the IRS. But the number one destroyer of wealth is actually divorce. When a judge splits your assets in divorce, they don't just take half. They can force liquidation, shatter businesses, and trigger massive tax bombs. I'm Douglass Lodmell, and for the past 30 years, I've been an asset protection attorney. I built legal vaults that protect over $5 billion in client assets from predators, plaintiffs, and also ex-partners. Today, I'm going to show you how traditional protection strategies don't always work, and the exact cheat code 1% use to actually divorce-proof their money before they ever walk down the aisle. What is family court? Well, that's the place that divorces end up being adjudicated. And family court is really one of the most powerful courts you can be in. When you get a divorce, you are fundamentally subjecting yourself to a very deep, broad discretion by a judge. Broader in most cases than just a civil court, because we're dealing with a family and the assets and the question of whether these assets are community or family assets or if they're separate assets. And so the judge has discretion to do things like break into and split IRAs or 401ks, which a regular judgment creditor would actually not be able to get into. And so divorce is one of the most dangerous places to be when you're talking about splitting assets or losing your money. So the other issue is that because you're dividing assets, if a court determines that the assets are marital assets, they can force a division. They, in other words, can just break up the asset. Well, what if the asset is a piece of real estate that you'd rather not sell? Then one party has to buy the other party out. An appraisal has to happen. You've got to get a value. It's got to be agreed to. And if there's not enough cash to do that, a judge can literally force the sale of the asset and the liquidation. That can be tremendously disadvantageous to both parties, frankly, because it might not be ripe to sell. It might be a bad time. The other thing about divorce is a lot of times what's in everyone's financial interest doesn't govern because it's personal, because we're talking about relationship. Oftentimes, irrational decisions kind of rule the day. So it's very, very important that you try to keep yourself out of a situation where you're just at the mercy of a divorce court. So let's take an example. Let's say that the family has an investment property. It's a commercial building. It's got several tenants in it. And let's say it's worth $4 million. That's what it's worth on a good day in the best of times. And actually what happens is one of the tenants moves right before. So it's kind of empty at the moment. And then you lose another tenant because you just happen to hit bad time in the market. So all of a sudden, this $4 million building, if you look at it from an income standpoint, it might only be worth $3.2 million right now. Well, the parties aren't getting divorced 2 years ago, and they're not getting divorced 2 years from now. They're getting divorced right now. The parties are getting divorced today. And so now the judge is going to say, okay, well, let's get an appraisal. The appraisal is going to come in at this lower number. Why? Because we lost some tenants, the income is down, the cap rates are down. Everything is not exactly how it should be. But the parties, or at least maybe one of the parties, really understands that this building is worth $4 million and it actually is probably worth $5 million. That's what it's really worth, because there's some plans to actually increase the rents, improve the property. And so it's really going to be a financial hit to the family if we take a building that the parties, or at least one of the parties, believes is really a $5 million asset, but it's only going to be divided at 3.2. Now, if that party who thinks it's a $5 million asset has the cash and liquidity, or if there are other assets in the estate, then that party might actually be happy with this lower valuation. And they say, okay, great. I'll give you, the 1.6 million bucks for your half, and I'll keep it, and then they can take advantage of it. On the other hand, let's say there's not cash available, or the other party is just not willing to do it, or they can't agree on an appraiser, and the judge just says, okay, forget all of this, we're just going to sell the building. Now the building is for sale, and it's a little bit of a fire sale. So you hope you even get the 3.2 million, but you might even get less than that. So this is how a divorce can just destroy the value of an asset, which is just not ripe to sell. Even worse is the value of a business. Businesses have often one value to the owner-operator and a completely different value to the market. And so for the owner-operator, if you have a business which grosses $5 million a year and nets $1 million a year, that's $1 million of income every single year. However, if that business is put up for sale, because maybe it's a service business or it doesn't have a big multiple, that business might only be worth $1.5 million or $2 million or maybe $3 million at best. But that's just 3 years of income. And if a business had to go through this same analysis and ultimately get sold, that can be devastating for a family in a divorce. Now, hopefully the business doesn't get sold, and often the business does not get sold, but it does get value. And that's the problem, because the parties often know that the value of the business to the owner operator is just more than the value of the business in a sales context. And so that's where fights come in. The two biggest areas of fighting in a divorce situation is the valuation of assets that are difficult to value. Real estate is actually easier. Businesses are the worst. Businesses are the hardest to value, because the perceived value is just different for what a buyer would buy it for and what it's worth to you, the operator. So again, divorce is just a traumatic situation when it comes to an asset. And many people, their primary asset, the main thing they have is this business. And it might generate great cash flow. It might generate that $1 million a year, and the family has been living really well. But they don't have $10 million in the bank to split up. They just have maybe $3 million of other assets and the $1 million of income. And in a divorce, that starts to look really thin. And that's when people start fighting, because the reality is that in a divorce, the living standard of both people individually has got to go down as compared to both people together. They just don't have enough in assets or in income to support the same lifestyle when they're sharing all the assets as they do to duplicate all the assets. You can't keep the same house, the same payments, the same cars, the same lifestyle when you have to do it twice. And that's frankly a lot of the times the reason people will not get divorced, just because they know they cannot survive at the same level if they get divorced. And that's often also why divorces are so contentious, is because people don't want to give up what they've already had. That's the one thing I've learned working with people and their money over the past 30 years. Nobody wants to give up something they've gotten used to. And unfortunately, divorce is exactly the situation where that's what's going to happen. So what can be done? Well, one of the main things that you can do is what's called a prenuptial agreement. And what a prenuptial agreement is it's actually an agreement where the parties lay out the assets that they have as they're entering the marriage. In other words, that they already have before they get married. And they're agreeing to how these assets would be kept as separate assets or combined as marital assets, and therefore how these assets would be divided in the event of a divorce. These prenups can be quite creative. They can have time limits on them, or markers or benchmarks or goalposts. So you could say, hey, if we get married, these are our assets. The wife has $4 million. The husband has $500,000. We're getting married. We're going to keep ours separate. But if we're married for 10 years or more, then the assets become community or marital assets. Or the assets never become community or marital assets. We're going to get married. The actual wife has a really beautiful $1.5 million house that the husband's going to move into when they get married. When they get married, the house would actually become marital property, but only the house. Everything else would become separate. Or you could say, hey, if we stay married 10 years, then the house becomes marital property, but the other assets stay separate, including the growth in those other assets. So again, if one spouse has a stock portfolio with $2 million that they get married and that's what they're starting with, and they're married for 10 years, and now that stock portfolio is $4 million or $5 million, the whole $5 million is still a separate asset, as long as that's what the prenuptial agreement said. So prenuptials are pretty powerful. They were not always this case. When they first started being used, there was a lot of disputes. The courts in most states hadn't really ruled on them. There was a lot of presumptions that both parties didn't have equal access to counsel, and they were kind of put this prenuptial in front of you on the day of the wedding and say, sign this or we're not getting married, and every family is there and everybody's flown in, and there was a lot of pressure to sign it on the wedding day or just right before. So, but nowadays we have very clear guidance. We know what prenuptials will work, what requirements there are in each state. A family attorney who drafts prenuptial agreements will tell you exactly. Obviously, both parties need to be represented by legal counsel. Usually there's a waiting period. The prenuptial can't be signed within a few days of marriage, or often even within a month of marriage. The assets have to be fully disclosed. You can't leave off half of your assets and then sign a prenuptial agreement and say, oh, well, I just left off all that because that was already separate. No, that can invalidate the prenuptial agreement. So there's a lot that goes into it, but if you get it right, if you follow the rules, a prenuptial agreement can be very, very effective. And I do recommend that if you're getting married, particularly if it's a second marriage or a third marriage, and you've been through this before, and you do have a lot of assets, and you just don't want to go through it again. You want to be clear this time. However, as we all know, there can be a psychological challenge to getting a prenuptial agreement signed or even bringing it up. It's kind of not very romantic to say, oh, honey, would you marry me and sign a prenuptial agreement? So I talk to a lot of clients that call me and they are not yet married. And I will ask, do you plan on signing a prenuptial agreement? And their answer is, I don't think it's going to go over very well. And so my answer is, well, if it's important to you, I think you need to address it. Having clarity in a marriage is one of the most powerful things you can have for a good, strong marriage. I really believe that. I've seen that over and over. I can see it in my clients. The ones that are open and honest and don't shy away from these difficult conversations are the ones that have the strongest relationships. But I also do understand it is not very romantic. And certainly for a young person, first marriage, very, in your 20s, but often those people don't have a lot in assets yet. But that's not always true anymore. There are now many young people that have quite a bit in assets. So my feeling is that it's a conversation you should have. Whether you choose to sign one or not, that's going to be up to you. But I do not think you should be afraid of having the conversation with your partner. I really think you should have the conversation, even if you choose not to sign a prenuptial agreement. So what if you're already married and you missed your opportunity to have a prenuptial agreement? And you did, because prenuptial means pre-nuptial. Nuptial is weddings. Pre is before. So if you did not sign an agreement before you got married, then you did miss the opportunity for a prenuptial agreement. However, there is such a thing called a postnuptial agreement. Post means after, nuptial means marriage. So after marriage agreement. So if you are married and you wake up one day and you realize, wow, this is a stress in our marriage. And this happens a lot. I can tell you, I have a lot of people call me and they are married. They're married, 3 or 4 years, 5 years, 10 years, even 20 years. And they're going through stress in the marriage, and finances is the number one thing, because they still are very concerned with not just dividing assets today, but continuing to grow assets. So often when I see this come up, I see it come up in the context of a more mature marriage that maybe had kids, maybe they're empty nesting now, and the parties are going through their own individual struggles and the marriage is on the rocks. And one of the big contention points is finances, like what's going to happen. And let's say one of the parties has, a big opportunity to invest in a new business and they think it's going to make a lot of money. Or one party thinks that Bitcoin is going to be $1 million and wants to put all the assets in Bitcoin, and the other party is much more conservative and doesn't believe in that and is concerned. So that's the case where a postnuptial agreement is appropriate. So a postnuptial agreement happens after the marriage, and it is the similar agreement. It is negotiated. Both parties need to be represented by legal counsel, in other words, by attorneys. And those attorneys would negotiate and effectively divide the assets now as if you were going to get divorced. Talk about future income, talk about assets, and then agree to stay married. And so you are staying married, but you're kind of going through the financial divorce part now by signing a postnuptial agreement. You can even do a transmutation agreement, which transmutes certain property from individual separate to community or vice versa. Those are also very powerful and they can be very effective. That is something that can be considered if you are already married and yet you would like to see some financial clarity, which you didn't get before you were married. And often, again, that's actually the time when you have money as a family, you've been working for 20 years, now there is a family nest egg, and you'd like to get it clear. So is that all you need to do? Well, not necessarily, because everything also can be strengthened a great deal by once you're clarifying the separate nature of the property, either before you're married. So once you've either done a prenuptial or a postnuptial, is that all you need to do? The answer is no. There is something else that you can do, and that's called asset protection planning. So if you have separate assets, either you have not yet gotten married, then the best course of action is to do two things: sign a prenuptial agreement clarifying everything, and put an asset protection plan in place so that you actually take those assets that are now clarified in the prenuptial as separate and not community or marital assets, and putting them in a legal structure that actually makes it enforceable. In other words, it's the teeth in the agreement, so that if any point in the future that agreement is contested or in any reason might not be held valid, you can enforce it because you've put in place an asset protection structure. This can be done before you're married, or it can be done in conjunction with a postnuptial agreement after you're married. It cannot be done, to clarify, while you are in a 20-year marriage and you grew all these assets together and now you're thinking you might need to be getting divorced, let me run and do an asset protection plan to protect all my assets for my spouse. That cannot be done. It's not clear because you don't know if you're putting separate or community assets in that structure. And again, we started this with family court. Family court will not care about your asset protection structure, and they will be very, very hard on you for even trying it. So I don't think it's a good idea at all. I can tell you I get those calls all the time. Somebody's calling me saying, I don't know if we're getting divorced, but I just want to be sure. That means I'm getting divorced and I want to make a plan. And then they want to put everything in. And oftentimes their rationale is, the assets are already in my name. The one spouse was already kind of the financial spouse and everything is in their name. And they just feel like, they're in my name. They're really kind of mine. That's not true. They're not yours. You are holding them for the family. They are the families. And again, what proportion and what percentage will depend on the state you're in, your prenuptial agreement, if you have one, the rules of that state on how a divorce court would look at dividing those assets. But for sure, just having your name on the assets is not enough. That is not going to get the job done to make it your assets so that you can plan separately. So asset protection is fantastic. Done before you're married with separate assets in conjunction with prenuptial is even better, or in conjunction after you're married with a postnuptial agreement. So if you have significant assets and you plan to get married, you need to know exactly how exposed you are. You can take my free 7-minute asset exposure test, scan the QR code on the screen, or click the link in the description. It will show you exactly where your wealth is bleeding. 8 would be at the high end of insurance, 6 on the low end.